My son's room stinks. There's no other way to say it, and no beating around the bush. His room is absolutely foul. If he was a teenager, I'd have assumed it was just a byproduct of puberty. But this smell is something much more pungent, and he's only 10. It started a week after we'd moved into the new house. There was no slight funk that led up to the stench. I walked in to wake him up for school one morning, and there it was. As I inhaled to call his name, the smell hit the back of my throat with such a force I gagged mid-yell. Being exposed to something so atrocious couldn't be healthy. It smelled like mildew and death. Tommy slowly rose from his slumber, seeming unbothered by the smell at all. I dragged him out of bed, my breakfast bobbing in my throat the entire time. "What the hell was that smell?" I mumbled under my breath. "Danny's stinky," Tommy mumbled. At the time, I chalked it up to half-asleep mumbo-jumbo, but now I'm wishing I hadn't. I grabbed him an outfit straight from the dryer, worried the clothes in his closet had been doused in the stench, and rushed him out the door of the bus stop. I had to find the source as fast as possible. I globbed Vicks under my nose, and the hunt began. The second entrance was no better than the first. I was only in the room for about 30 seconds before I had to puke. With an empty stomach, I tried again. Aside from the disheveled bed, nothing seemed out of place. No sign of a busted sewage pipe, no left-out food, nothing. I dug through his closet, his drawers, and his desk. As I kneeled down to check under his bed, the intensity of the smell became increasingly overwhelming. It was the carpet. Had I been moving faster, I would have laid my head against it to look under the bed. The thought of whatever caused the smell on the carpet touching my skin made me squirm. There weren't any stains or spots that I could see, but I was sure of it. I pulled out my carpet shampoo and went to work. The hum of the machine calmed me. As I pulled the machine back, the dark water settled, small oil cells forming. Yet the beige carpet looked exactly the same as before, and yet the water? It just didn't make any sense. I dumped the container and set back to do them again. It took 4 passes before the water was clear. The inescapable putridity from before was gone. At the dinner table that night, I mentioned the carpet to Tommy. His eyes shifted, and his cheeks blushed, his fork making soft circles around his plate. I was completely sure he was hiding something. After some gentle pressing, Tommy sighed. "It's Danny. He's my age and he's my friend. He said that he has to sleep outside, and that's not right. It's cold out there, Mom." I tried my best not to allow the shock I felt inside escape onto my face. A boy, either abused, homeless, or quite possibly both, had snuck into my son's room the night before. That awful smell was from another person. I cleared my throat, trying to push the anguish back down before I spoke. "If Danny comes back tonight, how about you wake me up, and he can come in the front door this time. We can get him cleaned up, and maybe he's hungry. We can save some leftovers." And call the police somewhere in between all that. But Tommy didn't need to know that part. "It'll be like a sleepover," I told him. Tommy grinned. "A sleepover? That would be so great. He could sleep in the bed with me this time, instead of on the floor. He was all wet last time. I think that's why he's so stinky." I grimaced internally. This poor boy. What had he been going through? That night after Tommy had fallen asleep, I opened his door across from mine and waited. I vowed I wouldn't sleep at all if that's what it took. But the day had worn me down. At some point I must have dozed off because the sound of Tommy's screeching yanked me from my bed. The foul odor was back with a vengeance. Tommy was hysterical, and there was no other boy in sight. Still crying, I snatched him up, blankets included, and slammed the door before examining him. Tiny fingerprint bruises were forming along his forearm, but worse, his arm hung at an odd angle. Tommy quietly cried the entire way to the emergency room. I tried to ask him what had happened, but he only cried harder. When we finally got back to the room, the nurse explained that Tommy had a dislocated shoulder. As I held him while the doctor popped his shoulder back into place, he felt so small. After, when asked what had happened, I had no answers. The nurse glanced towards me suspiciously before asking Tommy if he'd be okay with me stepping out of the room for a minute. My jaw nearly hit the floor. There was no world where I had ever hurt my son, but I knew refusal would only make her more suspicious. I took a seat in the chair outside the door. After a few minutes, the nurse asked me to come back in. Has your son ever mentioned a boy named Danny? My voice shook. He has. I haven't met him. My son says Danny is his age. I think he is either homeless or abused. My son said he's been sneaking him into his room at night to give him a place to sleep. I only caught on yesterday morning because of the smell. The boy reeks. I'd asked Tommy to come to me if Danny ever came to the window again. I wanted to try to get the boy some help, I finished weakly. The boy I had earlier been desperate to help had done this to my son. I just knew it. Tommy says Danny came to the window again tonight, and he let him in. He told Danny he wanted to wake you up for a sleepover, and Danny became angry. We're required to file a report on things of this nature. Someone will be in touch. The drive home was quiet. Just before we pulled into the driveway, Tommy's voice was as small as he'd felt my arms in the hospital. Mom, he said he wanted to take me home with him instead, that we could have a sleepover there. He said he lives in the lake. Tommy slept in my bed that night, but I didn't sleep at all. After making sure every window and door were locked, I was left with my thoughts. Lived in the lake? My mind wandered to the lake in our backyard. Tommy hadn't given any kind of sign that he'd been afraid of the lake before, and this wasn't a nightmare. The smell and injuries had proven that. Something tickled my brain, something just out of reach. I hopped on the internet and searched for Danny, 10 years old, then I typed in the name of our town. The first search results gave me my answers. Danny Sanders, 10 years old, missing. There wasn't much information in the article, but then again the police didn't seem to know very much. There was a picture of Danny. Dark brown hair hung across his eyes as he smiled, and just below it, a video. At 7:15 a.m. this morning, the Sanders family discovered their son, Danny, missing from his bed. Police are asking the public to keep an eye out for this boy. The same photo of Danny flashed across the screen. And if anyone has any information, to please come forward. And now a word from Mrs. Sanders. The anchor's concerned face lingered on the screen for a moment before the feed transferred over. I nearly screamed as the video continued. My son Danny is my world, my only son. This woman was sobbing in front of my house. Please, we just want him back safe. He's a good boy. Please. The last word clipped short as I closed the page. I think I know where Danny is sleeping now, and I think he wants my son. I've always wanted to have a child. Ever since I was little, I've been a natural caretaker, praised for my responsibility and maturity. So when I found out I was pregnant with my husband, I was overjoyed. My husband was too, and for a while our life was perfect. Hudson and I had been high school sweethearts, and we had always dreamed of having a kid together. My dad, on the other hand, was angry. He refused to help us with the baby in any way. I hate to say it, but I knew it was because he didn't like Hudson. I expected him to react angrily, but he was my only remaining family, and it stung to see him so unsupportive of my life. Despite the circumstances, I was still excited to be a mother, and began to prepare for our new life. I bought parenting books and studied them for hours. I took prenatal classes to prepare myself for birth, and I bought everything a baby could need. It put some strain on the relationship between Hudson and I, as we were supposed to be on a tight budget. Back then I was still employed as a receptionist for a dental practice, but I was planning to quit when the baby was born. Hudson wasn't super supportive of that, but he was resigned to the fact I wasn't going to budge. I wanted to give our baby the best life possible, and I wanted to be around for them at all times. Everything changed when that thing was born. I went into labor 2 weeks before I was due, so it came as a shock when my water broke halfway through date night. Hudson rushed me to the hospital. I spent the next 47 hours in labor. I was prepared for pain before I got there, but not this level of agony. And when I say agony, I mean the worst pain you can possibly imagine. My whole body burned and stung, and throbbed with stabbing pains, like thorns being pulled across me. I'd refused any kind of pain medication when we first arrived, as I wanted to do it naturally. I immediately regretted my decision, but was too stubborn to take it back. I felt blood run down my chin, as I realized I'd been biting my lip. Blood, sweat, and tears pooled on the bed. The nurses assured me it was nothing they hadn't seen before. I was in prolonged labor, but this was pretty common, and I should try not to worry. However, I knew this was different. I didn't care what the nurses and doctors had to say. I could read the truth on their worried faces. They knew just as well as I did that this was not okay. Nearly 2 days of pure agony later, I entered active labor, and it was born. I knew as soon as they pulled that thing out that it wasn't my baby. I can't explain it. Maybe it was the way it looked at me with ratty little eyes. Maybe it was the way it snarled with its toothless jaws. Or maybe it was how it reached for me with hands that seemed more like claws. Hudson stood by the bed holding it and smiling, telling me we did it. I was a mother. I couldn't even look him in the eye. Then the thing let out a scream. Not the kind of scream you'd expect from a newborn, but a shriek. I blocked my ears and started to weep. I begged Hudson not to bring it home, pleaded with him. That was when he lost it. He shouted at me that I was being a horrible mother and completely delusional. Those words stung me. Being a mother had been so important to me, but now it seemed so insignificant. Without a word, I stormed inside the house. I ran into my bedroom and cried. Every night the thing would scream that ungodly shriek. It was driving me insane. Hudson would get up and try his best, but it seemed that nothing would work. It went on like this until Hudson too refused to get up for it at night. I couldn't bear it. I knew I had to do something. I walked into the nursery that should have belonged to my child. Approaching the crib for the first time since leaving the hospital, I noticed the claw and bite marks that covered it. Black liquid oozed out of it and pooled on the floor, corrupting the passed-out rug that belonged to me as a child. I looked inside the crib to see a monster. It had black eyes and the palest skin I had ever seen. Its teeth were sharp and jagged like fangs, and it smirked at me when it saw my horrified face. I'm not ashamed to admit that I ran. I left the room, the house, and my family. I had known that thing was wrong, and this was my proof. I ended up at my parents' house, sobbing into my father's arms as the night wore on. He didn't even ask me why I had left, just told me he would prepare the guest room. I've been staying here at my father's for the past few months, and I haven't heard a word of news from Hudson. I hope to God he's okay, but there's no way I'm going anywhere near that house again, near that thing again. I haven't told anyone I know what happened, and I don't plan to. I thought I would share my story here, and maybe someone can make sense of it. I hope to God every night that thing isn't what I think it is, but I know my prayers are wasted. I was around 12 years old when I got the big bedroom for myself. Me and my brother are only 1.5 years apart, and for some reason we used to sleep in the same bedroom. So when I finally got it for myself, I was very happy. Keep in mind that we have always slept in the same room, and for years it felt normal. Nothing creepy happened. But already on the first night of me sleeping alone, something weird did happen. For background, we had a staircase on the first floor next to the kitchen, and as soon as you landed on the top step, my bedroom door was on your right. Everyone was asleep when I heard it. Someone was walking up the stairs. I knew that nobody was awake. My bedroom door was open. I would have noticed if anyone were walking downstairs. I lay still as a corpse, and it just continued. I knew the sound of my stairs, and how many steps it would take for a person to land on the first floor, but right at the end it stopped. My heart was pounding like I was being chased. My mind raced. However, I convinced myself that it must have been my imagination. The next night, the same thing happened. Just like the night before, everyone was asleep, and suddenly it sounded like someone was coming up the stairs. I thought to myself that I wouldn't be afraid. I had seen a lot of things already at that age, and I knew how to make it go away. But just as last night, whatever was walking upstairs stopped at the last step. The third night, I convinced my friend to stay over. I hadn't said anything to her. It was a way for me to get to sleep in the living room instead of my bedroom, since we had a pull-out sofa down there. From the living room, we could see through the kitchen directly to the staircase. We'd slept in the living room before, and nothing ever happened. In the middle of the night, my friend woke me up. She was afraid because she felt like someone was watching from the staircase. I looked, and I couldn't see anyone. It could have been my brother who wanted to come down to get something to drink, or to mess with us. But no, there was no one. Nothing but this eerie feeling of someone watching. We went back to sleep, but my friend wanted to go home as soon as we woke up. Later, I asked my brother if he had ever witnessed something like that, and he said no. He said it must be my imagination. He even tried to make fun of me, saying that he could sleep in my room that night if I was afraid of sleeping alone. I didn't want him to. I wasn't afraid. At least I tried to tell myself that. That night, the steps didn't stop as they did before. My bedroom door was almost closed this time, but it suddenly started to open. 2 hands were wrapped around the door frame, like something was trying to poke its head around, pulling itself up from the staircase. I began to cry, screaming for my mom, but she didn't hear me. That made me even more afraid, since her bedroom door was beside mine, only a wall as thin as paper between us. I sat up and looked directly at the thing in the doorway, which was now becoming more visible. Its fingers were longer than a person's, and darker than the night. Something looked like eyes peering inside of my room. But the thing was, it wasn't looking at me. It was looking down at the foot of my bed, like it was afraid of something in the room, afraid of going inside. Then it disappeared. For days I was shaken up. I didn't tell my mom about it because my child brain felt like she had betrayed me for not hearing me when I yelled for her. Eventually my aunt came to our house. Like me, she has always seen stuff that others couldn't, and heard things, sensing a lot of crazy stuff. She told my mom that we should look at the little crawl space between the floors, that it was important, but she didn't say why. My mom then found the key. Mind you, we have never used the space, since it was too small to use for storage or anything like that. The key almost didn't even open the old trap door, because it was so old and hadn't been used since we moved in. To our surprise, an old painting of a little girl lay in there. We didn't know her, or where this painting came from, but she felt so familiar. My aunt then said something that still sends chills down my spine to this day. She said, "So this is how she looks, the girl that protects you from the dark." She told me that you and your friend were afraid of her, but you shouldn't be. Your brothers accepted her long ago. She lived and died here many years ago, before you or even the last owners lived here, and she told me that she didn't like the last owners. Didn't like your father either. She lives under the staircase, so that she hears who moves up and down and can spring into action when needed. She smiled at my mom when she said the part about my father, and I remembered how many times that he stumbled up or down the stairs, like someone had pulled a rug from under him. He even yelled at me one time, because he thought that I was the one who did something to make him fall. My aunt continued, "She protected you from the dark not long ago, though not the living dark this time, and she says that she will always be watching over you when you are vulnerable, or have forgotten to raise your mental walls." After that, I must admit I was still a little afraid when I heard footsteps on the staircase, but I reminded myself that at least the girl under the staircase had my back if anything dark, living or not, came for me. And I always remember to keep my guard up, both physically and mentally, always checking. If people stumble when they are around me for no reason, I take it as an indication of their intentions.